Namaste. Good morning. My name is Enrique Alvarez Casado. Unfortunately, I cannot participate in person in this great Congress, and I hope that this small presentation from Barcelona, Spain, I can contribute to some extent to the discussions that are taking place there. I am the research director of the Center for Applied Ergonomics in Barcelona, but I have the honor of being part of the largest ergonomics school in the world, the UPM International Ergonomics School. My presentation. I'm going to start by posing a problem. We all know that the main occupational risk factors that can lead to musculoskeletal disorders due to possible physical overexertion at work are the following. Force exerted. Postures and movements that are carried out with each body segment with localized pressures. And although to a lesser extent, exposure to vibrations and thermohygrometric environments. The extremes. But in addition to this possible labor requirement, due to occupational risk factors, the main factors are organizational. The job can be very demanding, but for how long? Exposure duration. At what pace are you working? And with what recovery periods? I want to present a small example to understand the importance of these organizational factors. Let's look at a typical work shift. 8 hours of work. Therefore 480 minutes. Within these 480 minutes we have 30 minutes dedicated to feeding. A lunch break plus 2 additional breaks of 10 minutes each. Therefore, effective working time. Net working time is 440 minutes. That is the duration of the exposure. Let's imagine that the person is performing a cyclical task in a food industry where they are being processed. Meat, and the person is making some cuts of the meat. Cycle time is 8 seconds. In other words, in 1 minute it will process 7.5 units. And that if this work is done during the 440 minutes, at the end of the shift it will have processed 3,300 units. Good. With this information we can assess the risk level of the person that we have here, with a medium significant risk in the right upper extremity and a low significant risk level in the left upper extremity. These levels of risk and therefore these probabilities of developing a musculoskeletal disorder in the upper extremities will be experienced by the person who performs this work for 440 minutes a day. Every day, that is, 20 days a month, for 11 months a year. Obviously, if we reduce the exposure time, for example, continue doing it every day of the year, but every day 240 minutes work fewer hours, the rest of the day does not work. Obviously we can calculate, recalculate and the risk indices will be lower. Same as if we slow down. They work all day for 420 or 440 minutes, but at a rate of 10 seconds each unit. Therefore, this slower work also reduces the risk index. Notice that these risk indices that we have calculated, we have observed a working day and we have assumed that every day they have the same level of exposure. What happens when it isn't? The problem may be more complex. Let's imagine every week. Every day of the week is different. That is to say, Monday is different from the exhibition on Tuesday and different from that on Friday, but all the weeks of the year are the same. For example, we imagine a small company, a micro-enterprise, where on Monday they receive the materials and start production. Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday they are producing and on Fridays they pack and prepare orders. What is the risk now for people? Because a day is not always repeating itself constantly throughout the year. Or what happens when the cycle is monthly? For example, a construction painter where he works 20 days, but of those 20 days, 10% is dedicated to transportation, moving around and getting to the works. 8% of the time transports materials. 10% of the time prepares surfaces for work. And then you have to clean up. Must sand. It must fill. And finally, 35% of the time paint the walls, the surfaces. And this monthly pattern is repeated throughout the year. What is the person's risk now? Or even annual cycles. For example, in agriculture we have some months of the year where we are planting, watering. Other months we are pruning and caring for the plant and other months we are collecting, harvesting the product. And this annual cycle is repeated every year. What risk are people now? Good. Faced with this problem, I propose the solution. There is a model. The mathematical model to make the calculation is called Multitask General Exposure Index. And it can be calculated. I do not entertain myself explaining the formula. It is simply a mathematical issue. You have this article available that you can consult online for free where this model is explained. The important thing, this model that I just presented that allows us to calculate a risk index. When exposure varies, either between days of the week or between weeks or throughout the year, we can apply it to both the OCRA risk indices and the lifting indices, the variable lifting index or the lifting indices of the Naos equation or the manual push and pull of Snooky-Plum loads. That is, we can apply it to any risk index that is a function. The risk is a function of duration. Therefore, when we talk about the daily exposure level based on the minutes that are exposed during the day, we obtain a multiplier that modulates the risk index. If the risk index, we can apply this multiplier. We can apply the multi. And that allows us. Let's look at an abstract example. An example where we have 7 different tasks with OCRA indices. Therefore, risk first column is the risk in the right upper extremity. Risk in the left upper extremity. Second column. These risks are the risk index that a person would have who would spend all day doing that task throughout the year. Same for task 2, task 3, task 4. This is called intrinsic risk, and it allows us to see that there is a task where it is very demanding for the right upper extremity, but very light for the left. And another task. Other tasks that are very light for the right upper extremity, on the other hand, are demanding for the left. Good. What happens when throughout the year the person is doing a small percentage of the time of each of the tasks? Well, applying this model we can calculate it. And although we were exposed to tasks that were very demanding for the right, in this case we finally obtained a trivial or very low-level risk. Very low risk for the right upper extremity and significant risk for the left. What happens if now the person does not work every month of the year? There are months of the year when you do not have a job and therefore the risk of your exposure is reduced. Obviously, this is reflected in the final risk index that the person has, and we can calculate it, being totally acceptable. And in the case that work every month, but the percentage of time outside varies from dedication to each of the tasks. For example, task 7 in this case, which is the lightest. He spends more time in the months of January, February and March, or October and November, and less time in the months between April and September. Well, here we can see in this graph, applying the model, what is the risk index for each month. And we see that obviously the months that you spend more time on lighter tasks, the risk is lower, and the months that you spend more time on more demanding tasks, the risk is higher for both the right and the left. And in the end, we can calculate the risk for annual exposure for both the right and the left. This is the explanation so that it is understood what is the application of this mathematical model that allows capturing that variability and those weekly, monthly and annual macrocycles. Obviously it is a rather cumbersome subject and difficult to calculate manually. For this reason I am going to present a simple tool that will help us. The simple tool is called the Ergo and PN VINCI tool, a tool developed by the UPM International Ergonomics School. Based on Excel, it will help us to apply this model. How does it work? It can be freely downloaded from the internet. How does it work? Okay. So I'll explain it briefly. It works in 3 steps and we are going to see each one of them. The first step will be to calculate the intrinsic risks of each task. Second case. The second step is to define a homogeneous group and determine the duration of dedication to each of the tasks. And the third step applies the automatic mathematical models automatically to obtain the risk indices. Well, in the first case, it is necessary. In the first step, what we are going to do is calculate the intrinsic risk indexes for each of the tasks. This means that we are going to calculate the risk index as if there was someone who was doing that task for 440 minutes a day. With a break to eat more. 2 more breaks of about 8 or 10 minutes. For 20 days a month, 11 months a year. What risk would a person have to carry out a task all the time? That is the intrinsic risk. And the intrinsic risk is going to be calculated for both repetitive work in the upper extremities such as manual lifting of loads and forced postures and pushing. Manual traction of loads. Here we see as an example a list of tasks and each task has been calculated what is the intrinsic risk based on the OCRA method. High precision checklist for both left and right. Additionally, some of these tasks also require manually pushing and pulling loads for those particular tasks. The intrinsic risk index based on the standard is also calculated in the ISO 11228 Part 2 method. Some of these tasks also require manual lifting of loads. These tasks are also evaluated. This risk is assessed using the risk index, whether it is the composite lifting index or the variable lifting index, and the intrinsic risk index is calculated based on gender and age for each of the tasks. And finally, It is also calculated using the TACO method. The intrinsic risk indices for the head, neck, back and lower extremities. Once we have identified the tasks and calculated the intrinsic risk indices, we proceed to the next step. Step 2. It is to define and identify the homogeneous exposure group. What is a homogeneous exposure group? It is a group of people who are exposed to the different risks in the same way and therefore, at the end of the work shift, at the end of the work week, at the end of the month and at the end of the year. Have each of these people had the same level of demand? They perform the same tasks more or less at the same rate for the same time. For this homogeneous exposure group, we introduce in the tool a typical day and representative day of each month of the year. For example, if they do not work in January, we do not write anything, and in this case the same information has been written for each month of the year. It would be that they have a work shift of 420 minutes a day on average, that they take 3 breaks of at least 8 minutes and a 30-minute lunch break. They also spend 10 minutes getting into uniform, 10 minutes to carry out cleaning, order and cleanliness, and 10 minutes to reach the work position and start the work activity. Therefore, at the end of these 420 minutes, subtracting breaks and non-repetitive activities, we are left with a net repetitive work time of 360 minutes a day. That is, 86% of the shift duration. On the other hand, we write in the tool how many hours that homogeneous group has worked each month. There may be months that the same work is not done. Because, well, for example, because there is no demand, because it is raining under construction and they cannot work, etc. Due to breaks or illnesses. In the graph that we see, what is the distribution of hours worked each month? The percentage is automatically plotted against a constant. The constant is 160 hours per worker worked per month. When we exceed that constant, it is graphed in the red zone. Good. Let's remember that the only thing we have to write in the tool is the total number of hours worked per month by the group of people in that homogeneous group. In our example there were 10. We will write the total worked by these 10 people. And finally, what we wrote is okay when you work. What tasks do you spend your time on? Since this is often difficult to determine, it is written as a percentage of the time. We must always explain 100%. Therefore, the sum of each column must be 100%, and we will explain when they are working that month what percentage of time they dedicate to each of the tasks that we had previously identified and evaluated. Once registered these percentages of time that surely the employer or the workers themselves will help us determine. We have finished. What is this tool going to do? This tool with that information will apply the mathematical model that we have seen, and it will provide us. What is the risk index for this group of people? The procedure to apply the multi-act model is that this year becomes a fictitious working day, reducing in a fictitious workday, and once we have the fictitious workday, we apply the classical models previously already proposed in the scientific calculus literature using the weighted arithmetic mean or the multi-task complex model. But I still want to explain. As a solution, a marvel, I want to present what is the great wonder that a group of researchers from the EPM International Ergonomics School has developed. And it is a tool that allows us to perform semi-automatic calculations, semi-automatic evaluations for construction and agriculture. This Ergo Hippie tool at VINCI tool, both for construction and agriculture. What this group of researchers has done is the following. It has taken a sector of activity. The organization of work has been studied, identifying all the tasks, the macro phases, tasks, subtasks, and what are the different ways that we can find ways to do those activities. Next, the calculation of all the intrinsic risk indices of all these tasks and their variance has been carried out. And therefore a library of pre-assessed tasks has been built. To show the potential of a library of pre-assessed tasks in these sectors, I will show a small example from the building construction area. In the area of building construction, obviously we have. It has been broken down into 4 macro phases where, for example, in the realization of the horizontal planes we only find ourselves in this macro phase. We find all these phases and we have transport of the mounting plates, positioning of those of the boards, construction of the steel structure, installation of the pipes, etc. etc. Only in the preparation phase of the forms we find a lot of tasks that we see in the different videos. Good. With all that decomposition, in the end there are more than 400 tasks left. All these tasks have been calculated OCRA intrinsic hazard indices for the right upper extremity and left upper extremity. Also, for all these tasks, the TACO risk indices have been calculated for both the head, neck and back, and for the lower extremities. In those tasks that have been identified, which also require manual push and pull loads, the risk indexes for pushing, manual pulling of loads and those tasks have been calculated. That have been identified as requiring manual lifting of loads. The NAO risk indices for manual lifting of loads by gender and age have been calculated. In this way, a library of more than 400 tasks is built. Previously evaluated. What is the utility that we can now evaluate? The risk of different homogeneous exposure groups in a quasi-automatic way. We are going to see an application example of this library under construction. Consider a homogeneous exposure group. In this case, let's consider the homogeneous group of workers who build walls. And therefore of all the phases, the only ones carried out by this group of people. These are tasks that make up phase of provision of materials and transport using forklift. Mortar preparation, lifting of the wall, and use of level to ensure the horizontality of the construction. Here we have the complete list of tasks. What is what do we have to write now to assess this exposure group? The only thing we have to write in the Ergo Ipsum VINCI tool is what is the typical day that each month of the year represents. As we have seen before, in this case they work 8 hours 480 minutes with 2 breaks. In addition to the one of the 30 minutes to eat. And 45 minutes of other types of activities that are no longer repetitive, such as getting to the job, order and final cleaning or putting on personal protective equipment. Therefore, in the end we are left with an average of 345 minutes of exposure each day when they work. Okay, how many minutes a month do you work? This is the second data that we wrote 200 in March, 200 minutes, in April 220. In May we see that different months of the year have worked different minutes. And of these minutes, for example, of the 200 minutes that they have worked in March, what have they dedicated the time to, and do we write this percentage of time? For example, we see that when building walls, bricks weighing less than 3 kilos or between 4 and 7 kilos or between 8 and 11 kilos, they have dedicated practically 40%, 10%, 15% and 15% 40% of the total time. On the other hand, they have dedicated 15% of the time to transport with a forklift in different conditions. We have already finished writing the organization of work. We get the final result and get the risk indices. Let's go see them. In this example, the tasks carried out by this group that build the walls, we see that there are 2 tasks. They are very demanding when we talk about Okra checklist. Therefore, they are very demanding on the upper extremities. The other tasks are mostly of medium risk, except for one task that is very light or without significant risk. After considering the time spent on each of the tasks and how long they worked throughout the year, the final result has been a medium risk. Both for the right and for the left. Regarding forced postures, here we see the intrinsic risks of the tasks they perform for both the back and the lower extremities and for the head and neck. These intrinsic risks were already pre-evaluated in the bookstore. Let us remember that to evaluate the intrinsic risk we have had to explain with the TAKO method. We have explained 100% of the work time, what percentage of time each body segment was in each of the postures. Considering the time they dedicate to each of these tasks, the end result is that we have a significant high risk. In the back, obviously in a standing position. On the other hand, for the head and neck it is a very low level of risk, and for the lower extremities the level of risk is completely acceptable. What happens for manual lifting of loads? The manual lifting of loads that we already had. We already had identified in the bookstore which of the tasks they perform involve manual lifting of loads, and therefore it has been recalculated. What is the exposure time to this risk? And it turns out that, since not all the tasks they perform require manual lifting of loads, the net time of exposure to this hazard is 49% of the time. As we see graphed here, of the risks, intrinsics that are already calculated in the library, as if they are performed throughout the day. Therefore, long duration every day for gender, for men, for women depending on the age range of the age category of the worker. That is why we have different risk indices. In the indices of risk of this exposure group we have to. In principle, for adult men the risk indices are one task has a completely acceptable risk and the other two tasks have a significant but low-level risk index. What is the final risk that we have automatically obtained by applying the intrinsic risk library? We have obtained that, even though they carry out demanding tasks, as their exposure time is short, in the end the exposure risk of adult male workers is completely acceptable. What's going on for him? Push manual traction of loads. When they are transporting materials, mainly with forklifts, that is when they are doing this type of labor demand. Obviously it is not during all tasks and therefore only represents 12% of the time. Although the tasks are very demanding, they are with very high risk rates, most of them. When we apply the annual cycle, we obtain that the risk is totally acceptable because the exposure time is very low. As conclusions, we have seen that work organization is a very important component when working conditions are not abnormal. Evidently, we already have mathematical models available to determine risk from variable exposures, whether weekly, monthly or yearly. Specifically, the multi-chain model. I have presented a very simple tool, ergo hippie in VINCI, which allows us to apply this model in a very simple way, especially when we have the tasks pre-evaluated. And that is work that has already been done by a group of researchers from the UPM International Ergonomics School in Agriculture under construction. And therefore, only by writing the work organization we automatically obtain the risk indices. And also using this model and this tool, we can simulate in a very simple way what is the expected impact on risk reduction due to changes in working conditions. But I think this is a topic for another presentation. Thank you for your attention. And also many thanks to the IPN research team for the great work they have done. Namaste.